To turn off the order button if the form is invalid, I need to find out if my overall form is invalid. And how do we find this out? In the end, there are of course a couple of ways. We could, for example, add a controls array to our order form and now add all the controls to that and then add another property which is valid for the overall form. And we update this whenever the user enters values. Now this would require quite some refactoring here and is only one approach. We can of course also simply add a new property in our state. So after our order form, which is this object, we could add a form is valid property, which is false initially, which we now want to update. So whatever you like, you can use both approaches. And then in input changed handler, so whenever we type, I in the end want to check if all elements are valid right now. And if they are all valid, I'll set this form is valid state to valid. So here I'll add a new constant. Constant is form is valid. I'll set it to false. And then I now need to check all my inputs for their validity. So here I'll simply for a loop through all my input identifiers in updated order form. This is this state object which contains all my elements. And I want to set form is valid here, should be a variable therefore. I want to set this equal to updated order form, select a given identifier, input identifier. This should also be input identifier, singular. And there access this valid property. So the property we're setting here in the end, but here we're setting it for one element. Here I'm looping through all the elements. I not only want to set it to this, because then again we would run into the problem that only the last check is the one determining the value of form is valid. So therefore I'll switch form is valid to true initially and check is this given element valid and is form is valid in general true. Only if both is the case, form is valid is updated to true. And if this is false and form is valid was true, then the resulting value will be false and form is valid will be set to false, because false overrides true. And with that I can then set my state and not only set the order form, but also set form is valid equal to form is valid, so to my variable here. So again, the right side here, form is valid, is referring to my variable, form is valid. The left side is referring to the property in the state I want to update, which of course is this form is valid property here. So with that, we should now know the overall form validity, and this allows us to disable the button. So I'll bind the disabled attribute on the button to this state form is valid, or to be precise, to the opposite. Only if the form is not valid, this should be disabled. So disabled is true if the form is not valid. Let's save this and let's see the result. We actually have to inspect the button because we have no special styling for invalid buttons. And we see right at the start, it is treated as valid, unfortunately, because it is not disabled. If I enter something here, this never changes. So our button isn't really updated with the state of our form. It's not really using our validity. Why? Well, because we use our own button element and there we don't know a disabled property. We have to go to our button element and there we can set disabled on this button and set it to props disabled, so to that property I just defined, because you have to remember, we are not using the original HTML button there. We're using our own implementation, so there we need to expect a disabled prop and pass it on to the native button disabled attribute. With that, if we save all files and go back, now you see it's disabled at the start. And if I enter something here, let's fill out all these inputs here with valid data. So now it should become valid, except for that it doesn't. So let's find out why is the validity not updated correctly. In the contact data component, it looks like we're not setting form is valid to true even if the whole form should be valid. Let's confirm this by logging form is valid here in the input changed handler. And let's go back, open the console log, and enter something in all these fields. And you see it's constantly undefined. Why is that? This is related to our inputs. Remember, we have this dropdown, which doesn't have any validation rules attached to it. Now, it also doesn't have a valid property, therefore. And if we then loop through all the elements and use this valid attribute, it of course isn't true or false for the dropdown, it's undefined. And undefined is always treated as false, but it also never changes to true. So a way to fix this is to simply still add this valid property to the dropdown, even though it of course doesn't have any validation rules, but therefore it should always be valid. So that's our delivery method dropdown. With that changed, if we now enter something valid into all these fields, let me inspect the order. If I now enter a valid email address here, you see the button becomes enabled. Now I can remove a method I added for debugging to my input changed handler. And now, of course, we also need to adjust the button. So on the button, we now need a special styling if it's disabled. So let's go to button CSS, and there I'll add a special class for my button class, a special styling I should say. For the disabled pseudo selector, I want to set the color to this grayish look so that the button now really looks disabled. Let's also set the cursor to not allowed here so that the cursor also reflects that we can't click this. Now we're also showing that this is disabled. Now let's turn our heads towards a tiny error you might already have discovered. If we change the value in a dropdown, we actually get an error message related to our validation. Let's fix this error in the next lecture.